Hi, good evening, everybody. This
Good
is
evening, sir. Good evening, ma'am.
good evening,
Good evening.
good evening, Sai. So this
Good
is
evening.
from the TAS TED Talks, that is TAS e-learning for trainees, and this is our fifth session. And I'm very happy to say that it's one of the new feature, or probably one of the rarest one in PG education in anesthesia in India, as an initiative by the Anesthetic Society to help postgraduates to prepare for their exams and face their exams confidently. So today we have an OSCE session at TED Talks 5. It's a rapid fire OSCE round 2. So before we go to the main session, I just want to give few important details for the students who are preparing for DNB. In day one exam, the DNB website says that the day one exam will be conducted on OSCE basis and day two exam as case presentation. But Dr. Pankaj says that this time, because of the COVID, it is a one-day exam, isn't it? July 21st.
Yes, sir.
So July 21st is the exam, and you will have all OSCE and the case presentation and the table over conducted in the same day. So OSCE, the pattern given by DNB is 25 stations with 5 minutes session per station, and each station will carry 8 marks per station, and total will be 200 marks. So out of 300 marks in practical exam in DNB, they have given 2/3 weightage to OSCE. So it becomes very important that students prepare for OSCE very well. And after every 7th station, there will be a rest station. That is the framework given by the DNB. And this time it is going to conduct online. I do not know how they are going to conduct, and because of the COVID situation. So the OSCE plus case and table viva will be 300. Initially, the DNB gave that students should individually pass OSCE and viva separately, 50% at least. And now the recent notification is that combined mark should be more than 150 for pass. So I think OSCE preparation must increase in our curriculum, at least for the next batch. So today we have Dr. Sai Janani. I don't think so we require any formal introduction to introduce Dr. Sai. She is a very prominent faculty, and she had come for many any indemnity issues. She's the rescue for us. Hi, Sai. Good evening.
Hi, good evening.
So you're as cheerful as ever. Huh? So I don't see smile fade away anytime. And we have Dr. Pankaj Jain Chenke. Hi, Pankaj. He's from Pune. And he did his post-graduation from Kolkata. Am I right? Pankaj, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
You did
Good
your
evening, sir. Good evening, ma'am.
Kolkata, right?
Good evening.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and he's from Pune and is awaiting his exam next week. And I should thank Dr. Pankaj for accepting this invitation to face this exam as a practice exam. Means he's having the exam next week and he's accepted to take this challenge. Thank you, Pankaj, and best wishes for you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
So I think Dr. Sai will take over from here.
Yeah. All the best, Dr. Pankaj. I'm sure you have prepared very well. So now we go to the first question. No? Yeah.
Okay, ma'am.
Okay. We go to the first question. It's a case scenario. Okay. A 36-year-old primary gravida is in labor suit. She has collapsed and you're called for resuscitation. Okay, so the question is, outline initial steps of resuscitation in a pregnant woman. Just outline, give me points.
Ma'am, as she is elderly primary and she is collapsed in labor ward, so I will first, as I'm on the call, so I will visit her. After visiting her, I will ensure safe environment there. Place a spine board below the patient and activate the maternal emergency response system. Then, ma'am, I will initiate after activating the maternal emergency response system. I will tap the patient, ask her if she is fine, and look for the signs of any response. If she is responding, ma'am, then I will along with it I have to give left manual uterine displacement, activate maternal emergency warning score system, and if she is responding, then I will await for further team to team.
She's not
And
responding.
Okay, now if she is not responding, then I will again look for her breathing and pulse rate, central carotid pulse rate within 10 seconds, and initiate CPR, ma'am, as early as possible. The CPR rate should be 100 to 120 beats per minute. Depth should be 5 to 6 centimeter. My first preference to have rapid airway secure rapid airway, ma'am, as early as possible, because the pregnant patient they tend to desaturate because of splinting
Early
of diaphragm. Yeah, ma'am. Early intubation. Yeah, ma'am.
Yeah.
Along with it, I will continuously give left uterine displacement with the help of a second responder who is along with me. Then, ma'am, I will, as soon as the automated external defibrillator arrives, I will shock her.
Okay.
Because in recent COVID era, it's better to shock the patient as early as possible and secure the airway as early as possible.
Okay. And one more thing. And within 4 minutes, you will try for a perimortem cesarean section.
Perimortem cesarean section.
Yes.
Yeah, ma'am.
So for the benefit of others, there are 4 salient points in which this obstetric patient's CPR differs from the normal CPR. Is the maternal emergency response system has a crash team of obstetricians and pediatricians.
Yeah, senior obstetrician, senior anesthetist, neonatal neonatologist, and senior midwife.
Yes, and there has to be a left tilt, and there has to be early intubation, and we should consider perimortem cesarean section within 4 minutes of finding her, within 4 minutes of no response. That is, during the second pulse check, you have to start cesarean. The idea is to complete it in 5 minutes. Okay, so we go to the next question. Why should we displace the uterus during resuscitation? Explain with reason.
Ma'am, because of the because after 20 weeks of in second trimester or after 20 weeks of uterus, the uterus comes above the umbilicus, so it compresses the aorta and inferior vena cava. So there will be decreased venous return, and because of this decreased venous return, there will be decreased cardiac output, which is by 30 to 40% decrease there in cardiac output. Yeah.
Very good. Next, what are the reversible causes of cardiovascular collapse in this woman?
Ma'am, the reversible causes, it is goes along with the mnemonic of B-CHOPS. B stands for bleeding, which may be DIC. E stands for embolism, coronary embolism, pulmonary embolism, amniotic fluid embolism. A stands for anesthetic complication. In anesthetic complication, it may be due to
she did not receive any anesthesia. Next.
U stands for uterine otomy, ma'am. C stands for cardiac diseases, aortic dissection, cardiomyopathy.
Okay.
H stands for hypertension, preeclampsia, eclampsia. Other causes includes hypoglycemia, hyponatremia.
Okay.
O stands from other causes from ACLS, which consist of 4H and 4T. The 4H comes hypoxia, hypothermia, hyperkalemia,
H plus ion.
H plus hydrogen ions, ma'am. And 4T consist of toxin, tamponade, tension pneumothorax. Yeah, ma'am, tension pneumothorax. And one is thromboembolism. Then, ma'am, and last comes sepsis.
Okay. Okay. And what is resuscitative hysterectomy?
And resuscitative hysterectomy is a term used by non-obstetric physicians and emergency physicians, which resembles the same as perimortem cesarean section for
Yes.
perimortem cesarean maternal delivery, ma'am.
Okay. Then we go to the next scenario. Well done in this scenario. We go to the next one.
Yeah, ma'am.
Okay. So a multigravida is undergoing LSCS under subarachnoid block. After delivery of the baby, the obstetrician notices uterine atony and alerts you for management of massive PPH. Okay, so the question is, enumerate the drugs used in managing PPH. Just enumerate only drugs.
Ma'am, it consists of uterotonic drugs like oxytocin, methyl ergometrin, 15 methyl ergometrin EGF2 alpha, then misoprostol. These are the uterotonic agents. The other pharmacological drugs which decreases the PPH includes, ma'am, tranexamic acid.
Yes.
Yeah, ma'am.
Okay. Then next question. What are the methods used to reduce blood loss in PPH?
Ma'am, there are, it can be divided into two parts, pharmacological and non-pharmacological. The pharmacological consists of tranexamic acid. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Tranexamic acid is an antifibrinolytic agent, ma'am. So the women's trial tells to give within 3 hours before the birth, and also as early as possible. 1 gram to be given in 10 minutes. Then, ma'am, to look for bleeding within 24 hours and repeat again 1 gram. It has. Then this is pharmacological, ma'am. Then non-pharmacological consists of surgical and non-surgical and interventional radiology. Ma'am, in non-surgical, it consists to give bimanual compression, uterine tamponade. Then in surgical, ma'am, Billings sutures, O'Leary sutures, and then, ma'am, interventional cardiology with the help of radiology, interventional radiologist. With the help of radiologist, we can use metal coil like gel foam to stop the bleeding in the internal iliac artery, or to the orient and to the fallopian tube arteries.
Okay. And the last is hysterectomy.
Yeah, ma'am, hysterectomy.
Okay. Then we go to the next question. A brief role of tranexamic acid in managing PPH. You've already dealt with it. No? Okay. Then next question. Importance of fibrinogen in managing massive blood loss. This is any massive blood loss.
Yeah, ma'am. Ma'am, the fibrinogen level, normal fibrinogen level are 400 to 600 milligram per dl. It has been found that the fall in fibrinogen concentration was twice the fall in HB concentration. So, in any massive blood loss or trauma, our goal should be to maintain the fibrinogen level between 150 to 200 mg per deciliter, ma'am.
Yeah. So
yeah,
it is found that lesser than this, there is high bleeding, so early correction.
Yeah, ma'am. Early correction with cryoprecipitate.
Yes.
Which consists of rich amount of fibrinogen factor 8, 1 milligram factor.
How much cryoprecipitate? Any idea?
10 pool of cryoprecipitate.
Okay. So what is your plan on transfusion? When will you transfuse this patient? In PPH, when will you consider transfusion? How much blood loss? And what are your criteria for transfusion?
Then the most common cause of PPH is uterine otony. So in uterine otony, the shock is out of proportion to the blood loss. So in normal vaginal delivery, if it is more than 500 ml, in cesarean section, if it is more than 1 liter, and if in hysterectomy it is more than 1.5 liter, then I will activate the massive transfusion protocol, which consists, and as soon as I diagnose its PPH, I will draw the blood I will send one DIC panel and one to the blood group and cross match. Infuse 2 liters of colloid till crystalloid and colloid along with it as the blood arrives. So as soon as the blood arrives, I will activate the massive transfusion protocol by telling the blood bank authority to keep 6 point of PRBC, 4 FFPs, and 1 unit of apheresis platelet or random platelet donor, man. So as soon as it arrives, I will give it, man. And I will look for along with it, I will look for INR. If it is more than 1.5, I will give 4 points of FFP. If platelet count is less than 20 to 25,000 per cubic millimeter, then I will also give platelet, man.
Okay. The next question. So this drug is sevoflurane. So we'll be asking you about it. Enumerate 3 advantages of sevoflurane with respect to halothane.
And sevoflurane has a low blood gas solubility as compared to halothane. It has less myocardial depressant activity as compared to halothane. Also, it has it doesn't get sensitized to epinephrine as compared to halothane, and it also doesn't gets metabolized to trifluoroacetic acid, which leads to fulminant hepatitis in halothane.
Very good. So then we go to next question. Describe the reaction of sevoflurane with soda lime.
Ma'am, the sevoflurane reacts with soda lime when the fresh gas flow is less than 2 liters per hour for prolonged duration of time. So at 65 degrees Celsius, it gets absorbed in soda lime, giving rise to compound A, compound B. These are 2 most compounds which are formed. All the other compounds still are also formed. The most important are compound A and compound B, man.
Okay. Then next question. Explain in brief the clinical side effects of sevoflurane.
And systemic wise, in CNS, it increases the intracranial pressure, intracranial cerebral blood flow. It is neuro excitatory and seizure activity is there. In the respiratory system, and it is abolishes hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction. It is respiratory depressant, and also it decreases ventilatory response to carbon dioxide. In CVS, it is direct myocardial depressant, man, at dose dependent more than 1 to 1.5 max. In hepatic, it decreases the portal venous blood flow, man.
Okay.
Yeah, these are
the next question. Define partition coefficient. Compare partition coefficient of sevoflurane and desflurane.
Man, partition coefficient is defined as ratio of amount of substance in one phase to that of another, to the amount of that another at a stated temperature when the 2 phases are in equilibrium at equal pressure and volume. And it is of 3 types, man. Blood gas partition coefficient, oil gas partition coefficient, and tissue gas partition coefficient. In blood gas partition coefficient, it denotes the measure of solubility of substance in the blood, and it influences anesthetic offset and onset. And the FA-FI ratio, which is PA-PI ratio or PA-PB ratio, is nothing but the partial pressure which we achieve in alveoli is nothing but equal to partial pressure of that inhalational agent in the brain. So sevoflurane has blood gas partition coefficient of 0.6, and desflurane has partition coefficient of 0.4. So as compared to
at 37 degrees Celsius.
37 degrees Celsius.
Okay. You have to always mention the temperature at which. Okay.
Yeah. So, ma'am, the desflurane is very low lipid soluble as compared to sevoflurane. So, because of this, ma'am, it will achieve faster onset and faster emergence as compared to sevoflurane.
Okay. Next question. Identify this equipment. and label its parts. Just tell me 1, 2, 3, like that, okay?
Yeah, ma'am. It is fiber optic bronchoscope, ma'am. Upper part of the fiber optic bronchoscope. The
Very
first
good.
one is eyepiece. Second one is, ma'am, diopter ring focusing. Third one is control lever. Fourth one is working port or working chamber port. The fifth one is, ma'am, diopter light source, and the sixth one is suction wall and port.
Okay. So we call this the control channel of the FOB. Okay. This entire assembly is called the control channel of the FOB because it controls everything. How will you disinfect the fiber optic bronchoscope?
Ma'am, after using the fiber optic bronchoscope, excuse me, I will first clean the fiber optic cord with the help of mild detergent, so that I will decontaminate. The decontaminate process, it removes all the blood secretions, whichever it was there from the patient end. So after doing this, ma'am, with the help of normal saline, I will, with the help of 10 ml or 20 ml syringe, I will push normal saline through the working chamber port, ma'am. And with the help of special brush, which needs to be sterilized first to sterilize the FOB, I will sterilize the working channel of the port and suction channel of the port, ma'am. And then after this, I will disinfect the FOB by keeping the fiber optic bronchoscope in 2% of alkaline glutaraldehyde or 1% peracetic acid. The contact time should be between 20 to 30 minutes. And after 30 minutes, I will again take out the FOB from the solution and again clean it with normal saline.
Okay.
And let it dry for at least 5 to 10 minutes, and then it can be kept in the place.
Okay. Explain how we will perform airway blocks.
Ma'am, first I need to take the consent of the patient. I will explain the procedure to the patient why I need to perform the block, because it is a difficult airway scenario. Then, ma'am, after explaining the procedure, I will give him IM glycopyrrolate 0.2 mg at least 30 to 45 minutes prior performing the block. Then nebulize him with 3 ml of 2% lignocaine for 15 minutes, ma'am. Then I will make 2 nasal plagets by soaking it within lignocaine adrenaline solution, and also pour drops of xylometazoline or oxymetazoline over the nasal plagets, and keep that nasal plagets in both nostril for at least 5 to 10 minutes. So after keeping those for 5 to 10 minutes, I will take out those nasal plagets and we'll start the performing the block. Ma'am, in this we can perform the block by say as you go technique, and the other one is to perform the blocks at by giving injection at 4 sites, three sites, ma'am. The first site is behind the tip of mastoid and angle of mandible. I will go for the mastoid process, ma'am, and direct the needle perpendicular over there and give 1 ml of 1% lignocaine anterior and posterior to the landmark. So here the glossopharyngeal nerve is blocked. So glossopharyngeal nerve, it supplies the upper epiglottis and pharynx part, ma'am. This one is glossopharyngeal. Then for internal branch of superior laryngeal nerve, I will block it as greater corner of hyoid, ma'am. By palpating greater corner of hyoid, the ipsilateral side which I need to block, I will make it prominent by pushing from the contralateral side and giving again 1 ml of 1% block above the greater corner of hyoid, ma'am. So here I will I will block the airway above the vocal cord, ma'am. And the last one is, ma'am, transtracheal injection, which blocks the vocal cord below the vocal cord, which is supplied by recurrent laryngeal nerve. So here I will use 2 ml of 4% lignocaine. The efficacy is same for 4 ml of 2% lignocaine. And with the help of syringe and 26 gauge needle, 20 to 26 gauge needle, I will insert over the cricothyroid membrane and look for air bubble and inject 2 ml of 4% lignocaine at the end of inspiration. So as the patient coughs out, the whole of the local anesthetic will block the region.
Very good. Next question. It's again a case scenario. This lady gives you a history of high BP readings and proteinuria during pregnancy, and she has been labeled as preeclampsia. And what is preeclampsia?
And preeclampsia is defined as per ACOG 2013 criteria with a systolic blood pressure of more than 140 and diastolic more than 90 after 20 weeks of gestation with proteinuria. Proteinuria should be more than 300 mg over 24 hours, protein create ratio more than 0.3 and 1 plus dipstick urine. And as per NH National Health Blood Pressure Education Program, it can also be defined without proteinuria. The following criteria it should meet: recurrent pain in the epigastric region or right upper quadrant region, and then fetal growth restriction should be there. Then persistent cerebral symptoms, then thrombocytopenia and elevated serum liver enzymes.
Very good. Classify PIH.
Ma'am, as per ACOG criteria, PIH is classified in 4 types: gestational hypertension, preeclampsia without severe features, preeclampsia with severe features, then chronic hypertension, and chronic hypertension with superimposed preeclampsia.
Okay. What are the diagnostic criteria for PIH and for severe PIH? Tell me both.
Previously, PIH and severe PIH means recent ones, the PIH and severe PIH we can define same as preeclampsia without severe feature and preeclampsia with severe features. Okay. So preeclampsia without severe features is consist of BP more than 140 by 90 mm of Hg after 20 weeks of gestation, 2 readings 4 hours apart, proteinuria more than 300 mg over 24 hours, protein create ratio more than 0.3, and 1 plus dipstick test, ma'am. And then in severe features, the blood pressure should be more than 160 by 110, thrombocytopenia where the platelet count should be less than 1 lakh per cubic millimeter. Then the new onset cerebral symptoms, oliguria for 24 hours. Ma'am, then serum creatinine level should be 2 times more as compared to the baseline, and non-pulmonary edema and impaired liver function.
Very good. What are the changes in pregnancy expected to be affected in PIH?
Ma'am, in changes in pregnancy affected as we go system-wise, ma'am. In cardiovascular changes, there is increase in blood pressure, which is secondary to the state of sympathetic overactivity, which leads to increase in peripheral resistance and increased systemic vascular resistance. It also increases the systolic blood pressure and cardiac output. The hemodynamic changes is divided into 3 subsets. First is hyperdynamic circulation with increased cardiac output. Then second is decreased colloid oncotic pressure, increased vascular permeability, high SVR, and markedly increased SVR with decreased blood volume and depressed left ventricular function. Then comes hematology in hemodynamic changes, ma'am, because of decreased choledonchotic pressure, which further falls from 22 mm of Hg to 18 to 20 mm of Hg. It leads to increasing vascular permeability and can lead to interstitial fluid overload, leading to pulmonary edema. In hemodynamic changes, ma'am, because of activation of common coagulation pathway, then fibrin degradation products are increased. Factor 8 is increased, platelet aggregability is increased, so it will lead to thromboembolic state. And also there is imbalance in the thromboxane A2 and prostacyclin balance. So here the vasoconstrictory effect of thromboxane A2 is more as compared to prostacyclin. So overall vasospasm will be there, and it leads to decreased uteroplacental blood flow. In renal changes, ma'am, because of glomerular endotheliosis, there will be glomerular enlargement, so there will be decreased GFR, and because of increased vascular permeability, there will be and decreased choledonchotic pressure, there will be proteinuria. Urate clearance will be decreased, so serum uric acid will be increased. Oliguria will be there, ma'am, and clinical implication, it can lead to acute renal failure in hematological changes.
Very good. When will you... You're done? No. When will you decide to proceed with regional anesthesia in a patient of PIH?
Ma'am, as per the NICE criteria, NICE guidelines, if the platelet count is less than 1 lakh per cubic millimeter without coagulation abnormalities, I can proceed. If the platelet count is more than 80,000, between 1 lakh and without coagulation abnormalities, I will proceed. And if it is less than 80,000 without coagulation abnormalities, I will proceed. And also, ma'am, if there is in systemic examination, if there are no signs and symptoms of impending failure,
yes, impending eclampsia.
And also, ma'am, if there is no papilloedema in eye signs, in that thing I will go for regional anesthesia.
Yes. Any you have to take care of platelet count, consciousness, and patient should be seizure free, and there should be no signs of increased ICP, and patient should be hemodynamically stable.
Stable, yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Then mention 3 differences comparing general anesthesia and subarachnoid block in PIH.
Ma'am, GA deals with the airway, so there will be sympathetic accentuation will be there. In subarachnoid block, we are not dealing with the airway, so there will be no intubation pressure response. A risk of aspiration will be more in general anesthesia, so we need to apply cricoid pressure for intubation. There is no as such risk of aspiration. If the side effect of local anesthesia is there, then the risk will increase in subarachnoid block. Then, ma'am,
then
ma'am, in GA, with the hemodynamics are in our hands, so it is very
better control. Yes,
better control as compared to subarachnoid block.
Yeah, in subarachnoid block, the hypotension in them.
Hypotension is there, ma'am. So because of that hypotension, there will be decreased uteroplacental blood flow. So fetal outcome will be affected in subarachnoid block. Even though it is not that marked in preeclampsia, but we have to consider not to allow the fall below 140/90.
Yes. Below 20% of their pre-op baseline.
Yes, ma'am, pre-op baseline.
Okay. So the next question, it's again a case scenario. A 24-year-old primary gravida with 22 weeks pregnancy is admitted for pain in abdomen, nausea and vomiting. She is diagnosed with acute appendicitis and planned for lap appendectomy. Okay. So what are the drugs that cause placenta? Anesthetic drugs that cross placenta.
Ma'am, the anesthetic drugs which readily cross placenta are anticholinergic, atropine, scopolamine, then antihypertensive, beta-adrenergic agonist, Pusat, nitroglycerin, benzodiazepine, diazepam, lorazepam, diazepam, midazolam, sorry, induction agents, all the induction agents, all the inhalational agents, then local anesthetics, opioids, and in vasopressin, ephedrine, ma'am. And the transfer, it depends on the lipophilicity. The weight should be less than 10,000 Daltons, and a high fraction of the drug should be unionized.
Okay, you have to only enumerate the drugs. You don't
Okay.
have to tell the criteria. Okay. Then, which is the safe period for elective surgery in pregnancy and why?
Ma'am, the safe period of for elective surgery in pregnancy is second trimester. Because, ma'am, there the cardiovascular changes are not at peak. Then, ma'am, yeah, ma'am, cardiovascular changes are not peak. Then there are no in first trimester the organogenesis has been complete. So in second trimester there is no teratogenicity happening as compared to first. So these are the reasons.
Also compare it with the third trimester. You have compared the second trimester with first. Now compare it with the third.
Ma'am, in third trimester, because
there is risk of preterm labor.
Yeah, preterm labor is there, ma'am. Uterine autonomy can be there in third yes. trimester.
No, it can precipitate preterm labor earlier in third trimester.
Yeah, ma'am.
Okay. Then how to prevent preterm delivery?
Ma'am, preterm delivery can be prevented with the help of tocolytic agents, ma'am. So okay. Tocolytic agents are classified as a calcium antagonist, which is nifedipine. Then, ma'am, COX inhibitors like indomethacin, ketorolac selindac. Then, ma'am, magnesium sulfate. The recent one is oxytocin antagonist, which is atosiban. And then nitric oxide donors like NTG.
And what are the implications of these drugs with respect to the anesthetic drugs with respect to exit procedures?
Ma'am, exit procedure, yeah, ma'am. Exit procedure is ex utero intrapartum treatment of the fetus. In this procedure, ma'am, the goal of the anesthesia is to relax the uterus and to facilitate the fetal surgery. So, ma'am, the inhalational agent are given at a higher MAC, about more than 1.5 to 2 MAC, to achieve good relaxation of the uterus. So, ma'am, in this case, as we give the anticholinergic, it can travel the uteroplacental circulation and go to the fetoplacental circulation, which causes side effects to the fetus, which can, and all the other induction agents like inhalational induction agents, they can lead to uterine relaxation, causing uterine autonomy as we finish the surgery, and fetal depression can be there, ma'am.
Hello?
Yeah, ma'am.
Yeah, okay. Then we go to next question. It's a case scenario again. A 69-year-old man is planned for umbilical hernia repair. He gives history of dyspnea on mild exertion. No chest pain or any other relevant symptoms. Clinically mild pallor is present. Okay. On investigation, hemoglobin is 8.9 grams per deciliter. Yeah. So outline the WHO classification of anemia.
And WHO classification is less than 5 years. The hemoglobin should be more than 11 gram per dl. In 5 to 12 years, it should be 11.5. In adult, it should be more than 13. And in pregnancy, it should be more than 11. And it is further classified as in mild, moderate, and severe. In severe, it is less than 7 gram per dl. in moderate it is 7 to 9, and in mild it is 9 to 11 gram per day.
Okay. How will you work up this patient?
Ma'am, it starts with the thorough evaluation of the patient in history taking. In history taking, I will ask the patient about what was the causes of anemia, like to rule out nutritional cause of anemia, if he was suffering from any chronic illness, any comorbidities. Then, ma'am, I will ask for in history. I will ask for his metabolic equivalent of TAS to find out his cardiopulmonary reserve, so that he can withstand the surgery. Then, ma'am, I will ask for any history of fistula, piles, hemorrhoids, ma'am, or if he has underwent any blood transfusion earlier. Also ask, yeah, ma'am, in investigation, I will ask for complete blood count to have
examination. Tell me 2-3 features which you'll see.
Some examination I will see for pallor in palpebral conjunctiva, ma'am.
Okay.
Then, ma'am, I will look for hyperdynamic circulation.
Okay, signs of hyperdynamic circulation.
Hyperdynamic circulation, water hammer pulse, increased heart rate, ma'am. And then if he is nutritional,
you look for a bounding pulse.
Bounding pulse. His nutrition status, ma'am. Yeah, this much in the.
And you look
exam.
for edema to see if the patient is in failure. And you look for Krebs. You'll auscultate for Krebs if he has, and JVP.
JVP.
Okay, yeah. Then you were talking about investigations.
Investigation in complete blood count, I will look for baseline HB, so that maximum allowable blood loss I will count before surgery, not to allow more than 30% of the hematocrit to fall. Then, ma'am, I will ask for peripheral smear to distinguish different types of anemia. Then total leukocyte count to rule out any nidus for infection. Then coagulation profile, PT, INR, I will ask, even though it's not that significant, but to rule out any
coagulation abnormalities causing it. Okay.
Yeah, ma'am. Okay. Qualitative function and quantitative function of platelet I need to assess.
Very good. So, calculate the oxygen content of blood in a patient with HB of 6 gram% and SaO2 99% residing at sea level. Tell me the formula, substitute, and then the answer.
Ma'am, to calculate the oxygen content of blood, the formula is nothing but addition of combined oxygen and the dissolved oxygen. So, ma'am, the dissolved oxygen is very negligible part, 0.003 multiplied by partial pressure of alveolar oxygen at sea level.
Sea level it is at sea level it is
0.3, ma'am.
Okay.
0.3.
Okay, at sea level it's 100, so 0.003 into 100 is
100 is 0.3.
Okay. Now
and
hemoglobin part?
Yeah, ma'am. The dissolved content, the formula goes hemoglobin into 1.34 milligram per dl, which is the carrying capacity of the hemoglobin, and saturation. So if we go by the formula, it is 100 into 6 into 1.34 plus 0.3.
Okay, so that is?
No.
Okay, you will have to calculate. Okay.
Yes.
Multiply hemoglobin with 1.24 and the saturation.
Saturation means it comes 6 into 1.3. It comes, ma'am, 7.8 plus 0.3, which is 8.1.
Very good. 8.1 what? Units?
8.1 milligram per dl, ma'am.
No.
Gram per dl, sir.
It's volume percent, no oxygen.
Oh, yeah, ma'am. Yeah, volume percent.
Okay. Per deciliter of blood or 100 ml of blood.
100 ml, yeah, ma'am.
Then what is transfusion trigger, and what is its usefulness in deciding the need of blood transfusions perioperatively?
And transfusion trigger is defined as the value of Hb below which RBC transfusion is indicated. And its usefulness is to, as the blood is transfused, ma'am, the rheological effects of blood transfusion, the viscosity, it affects the microcirculation of the person, ma'am. And it depends on different age groups, and need of the also depends on the type of surgery, and pre-op condition patient, pre-op hemodynamic status of the patient. So, ma'am, for post-op patient, the transfusion trigger, if it is hemodynamically stable, it should be 8 gram per dl. Without signs and symptoms of chest tightness, dyspnea, orthostatic hypotension, tachycardia. If these are there, then the transfusion trigger should be round about 9 to 10 gram per dl. In critically ill patient, ma'am, our target should be 7 to 9 gram per dl. And in early sepsis, it should be more as compared to the late sepsis. The early sepsis, it is 9 to 10. In late, is 7 to 9. And we should not take the transfusion trigger to wean off the patient from the ventilator, mechanical ventilation, if Hb is more than 7 gram per dl. And in cardiac disease, intro-op, ma'am, as there is no consensus on that thing, ma'am, it depends on the individual patient, ma'am. So, because in CKD patient, we can take 7 to 8 gram per day, which is acceptable. So, I can't say a cutoff figure over there, ma'am. And in cardiac disease, restrictive transfusion strategies to be carried out, which consists of 7 to 8 gram per day. And in neurocritical care, ma'am, in traumatic brain injury, subarachnoid hemorrhage, and acute ischemic stroke, it should be maintained between 7 to 8 gram per day.
Okay. And pre-op transfusion trigger?
In which overall, ma'am, you are asking?
Pre-op. Preoperatively, at what hemoglobin will you say that the patient needs transfusion before surgery?
Ma'am, means whatever I have read, there is no such consensus.
Okay.
So
Okay, next question. We'll go to the next question.
HB level of more than 10, there is no need for pre-op transfusion. Okay. Then HB level of at an HB level of less than 6, you should consider pre-op transfusion. Okay. But at a level between 6 and 10, it has to be assessed individually. That is, a patient who is a normal healthy patient up to 6, you don't have to transfuse and take up for surgery. Okay. And at a level, suppose say cardiac disease, renal disease, then you have to assess the patient, his cardiopulmonary reserve, and then consider transfusion. This is in addition to keeping blood ready for intra-op losses. That depends on the surgery of the patient. For example, appendectomy, hernioplasty will be different from resection, anastomosis, and oncosurgeries. Okay.
Yeah, ma'am, major surgery.
This is for pre-op. Okay. This is what I wanted to add. Otherwise, your answer was very good. Okay.
Yeah.
Then we go to when will you take up this patient? When will you take up this patient, and how will you manage anemia?
That's what we saw.
Ma'am, at 8.9 gram per dl, he was having symptoms of chest pain,
mild dyspnea, no chest pain, mild dyspnea.
Dyspnea on exertion. So, ma'am, and it is umbilical hernia. So that the amount of blood loss is very negligible. So I
you
can.
will, okay, just a sec. You will organize your answer in this. You'll say patient factors is a
Okay, ma'am.
patient with mild dyspnea and a HbA of 8.9. Surgery factors, umbilical hernioplasty, where we do not anticipate much blood loss.
Good.
Then, okay. And
Yeah.
comorbidities. What were the
Comorbidities. Yes, ma'am.
yeah. Okay. What were the comorbidities in our patient?
No comorbidities. Ma'am.
None as such. Okay.
None.
So
Ma'am.
depending on this, I will, yeah, you can proceed with your answer. What will
Proceed
you
with this. And I
proceed with this?
will. I will reserve the blood and proceed the surgery with 8.9 gram per diem.
Very good, very good. And intraoperatively, when there is blood loss, how will you manage?
Ma'am, intraoperatively, I will manage with autologous blood transfusion.
I will keep a vigilant watch.
Vigilant watch, ma'am,
and, yes.
and
And I will calculate the blood loss. Okay, and
yes, ma'am.
I will calculate MABL, that is maximum allowable blood loss.
Allowable blood loss.
Yeah. When the blood loss in surgery exceeds MABL, then I will ask for
blood.
Yes, if the patient's other parameters also
Abnormal,
indicate
yeah,
so. That is hemodynamic instability, serum lactate. Okay. Otherwise, if the surgery is getting over, I can still manage by intra volume replacement. Okay. If I feel that I need oxygen carrying capacity, then that is when the patient tips towards anaerobic glycolysis by seeing serum lactate, or when I see that no, there is indeed a lot of blood loss, and okay, then I will.
Also, age is also there. Elderly geriatric is there.
Yes. Okay. Then I will ask for blood and be conservative in my approach. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Another thing is, if he develops any signs of myocardial ischemia also, you can
yes.
That will maintain the oxygen supply and demand.
Yes. Oxygen demand and supply ratio. Very good.
Okay, we'll go to the next one. Yeah.
Next question. It's again a case scenario. A 68-year-old male with diabetes, hypertension, CAD, with a drug-eluting stent in situ is posted for internal fixation of the right-sided femur, tibia, and ankle. He has had a PTCA to LAD 1 year back, and he is currently on tab ecosprin and clopidogrel. Expected duration of surgery is a bit more than 3 to 4 hours. So now, your question is, what will be your plan of anesthesia?
Ma'am, my plan of anesthesia, as the recent the orthopedic guidelines do say that for the femur fracture, the better outcome is if the surgery is performed within 24 to 48 hours.
Yes, so, you're talking about British Orthopedic Association guidelines, right?
Yeah, ma'am. Okay. So if the patient has a recent fall, like 1 or 2 days prior, then after stratifying the risk and discussing with patient and along with surgeon, and keeping in hand the blood products like 4 FFP, 4 PRBC and 4 bags of FFP, I will go with general anesthesia with endotracheal intubation and controlled ventilation.
Okay, and for pain relief?
Post-op pain relief, ma'am, if means he has stopped the clopidogrel at least 5 days prior, then I can insert epidural catheter. Ma'am. And as he has underwent PTCA to LAD, I don't know the type of stent which he has undergone. Is it bare metal or drug-eluting stent?
He has had a drug-eluting stent.
So the risk gets increased, ma'am, as he is 68-year-old with diabetes and hypertension. So I need to bridge it with GP2B3 antagonist, so that there will be less chances of thrombosis, which will lead to stent thrombosis. So I will use Glofiban I will use tirofiban. I will use cangrelor, ma'am, because it has very short duration of action, like 40 to 60 minutes uh, uh, action. So after 1 hour, I can put after initiation of cangrelor, and after 1 hour, I can put epidural catheter, and I will give post-op pain relief with epidural catheter and multimodal analgesia, ma'am. Either with paracetamol, 1 gram IV from at the start of surgery, and dexamethasone 4 to 6 mg IV.
Okay.
Yeah, ma'am. And the other GP2B3 antagonist are, ma'am, tirofiban, iptifibatide,
Okay.
which
No. Only your plan of anesthesia. That is all. You have done that. Okay. Now, how will you work up this patient?
as he is diabetic, hypertensive, I have to ask the patient in his history what was the cause, and also he has undergone PTCA for LAD 1 year back. What was the cause he went understood? What was his pre-op metabolic equivalent of task? As we can't evaluate his metabolic equivalent task as he has fracture. Then again, ma'am, if he has any signs and symptoms after stenting of the angina, then ma'am, his how is his glycemic control? Is he taking oral hypoglycemic agents, or if he is taking intravenous insulin or subcutaneous insulin? That I need to take in my chart. And in antihypertensive agent, ma'am, I need to ask him if he is on beta blockers so that I can continue till the day of surgery if my plan is general anesthesia. And also diuretics, if he is taking pre-op, because diuretics lead to imbalance in serum electrolytes. So I need to check in investigation and correct before taking the patient to the surgery. And also to rule out the recent trauma, ma'am, also because he can land up in diabetic ketoacidosis. So I need to rule out the signs and symptoms of diabetic ketoacidosis earlier to taking my patient.
We can organize this answer. Okay, when you're starting with history, again patient factors due to his age and due to his comorbidities. Start with diabetes. When you say diabetes, I will first ask for if he's taking his drugs, if he is compliant with them, and if it is controlled. What are the drugs he's taking? I'll ask history for the side effects. Then I'll ask for hypoglycemic episodes, and I'll ask for if he has gotten any investigations with him previously. Okay, and for end organ effects. Then for hypertension, again, I'll ask for the levels at which his BP is maintained, if he's taking them. Some of them have morning, evening records. Then I'll ask for the drugs. I'll see for the side effects, if any. And then I'll ask for, then I'll go to CAD. And for other end organ effects, then I'll ask for CAD. And I'll ask if he has any previous papers. I'll ask him for any residual effects after the CAD, and then I'll ask him if he's on any antiplatelets. Okay, then this is done. Then we go to examination. Tell me 2-3 points, important ones, that's all.
I mean, examination, I will ask for cardiac autonomic neuropathy, hypertensive neuropathy, end organ damage, ma'am, nephropathy.
No. In examination, what will you do?
In examination, I will look for any cardiac signs and symptoms of cardiac autonomic neuropathy, ma'am.
See, he has had a trauma. I'll look for pallor. I'll look for JVP.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. This is examination. I'll auscultate his chest. Okay, then I'll look for heart sounds.
Heart sounds, ma'am. In the respiratory system.
And I'll look for GCS because he has had such a bad trauma. And sorry, in history, we should also talk about multi-organ trauma. Rule out multi-organ trauma. Rule out TBI. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, ma'am. The pelvic fracture.
Then we go to investigations.
Yeah, in investigation, starting with basic investigation, complete blood count to for baseline HB, then platelet count, ma'am,
Okay,
then
a
total
complete
glucose,
hemogram. Then
complete hemogram, then coagulation profile, ma'am, as he is on ecosprin clopidogrel and regulating
okay,
stent is there, PT, PT and INR, ma'am.
okay,
As he is diabetic, his postprandial blood sugar level and HbA1c,
mm,
uh, as he is hypertensive, I will look for his serum electrolyte level
mm.
to rule out hypokalemia, ma'am.
Okay.
Uh,
Hypo or hyper? He can be on ACE inhibitors
ACE,
and
ACE or
ARB.
spironolactone,
So he
yeah,
could
ma'am.
have, yeah, he could have AR.
And also,
Hypercalcemia.
ma'am, yeah, ma'am, and also because as he is diabetic, I don't know the duration of diabetic, so I need to rule out
Yes.
a urine infection. I
Urea
need to
creatinine.
check, yeah, ma'am, urine routine microscopic examination and serum
Okay.
urine create.
Okay. Okay. Then, what is bridging therapy and what are the drugs used in bridging therapy? With respect to the drugs your patient is taking, he's taking ecosprin and clopidogrel. So if he comes for an emergency surgery, how will you bridge him? What are the drugs used?
Ma'am, the drugs used in bridging therapy are anti. It can be divided into two pharmacological agents. One is anticoagulant agents, and the other one is antiplatelet agents.
Yeah,
The
for antiplatelet agents. First, what will you prefer in him? The first line is?
Antiplatelet
Yes.
agent, ma'am.
Yeah.
The antiplatelet agent consists of GP2B3A antagonist. Intravenous, ma'am. I will go for intravenous. It consists of tirofiban, iptifibatide, and cangrelor.
Okay.
And
Do you know the
this,
regimen? Tirofiban?
it is, ma'am, 0.15 mg per kg per minute. Iptifibatide, I don't know, ma'am.
Okay, you'll have to read up all the three. Okay.
Yeah, ma'am.
And then if they are not available?
If they are not available, ma'am, and if I have time in hand, I can switch over to subcutaneous low molecular weight low molecular weight heparin. As I have stopped the clopidogrel 3 to 5 days prior to surgery and unfractionated heparin. So I need to stop subcutaneous low molecular weight heparin 24 hours prior to surgery and unfractionated if I'm using LM low molecular weight heparin like enoxaparin 40 mg subcutaneous OD-BD and in unfractionated heparin I need to stop it 4 to 6 hours prior to surgery, keeping the INR less than 1.5 for surgery.
Okay. Had you given spinal, what would you do if the spinal fails during surgery? Had you given spinal, some of them would also give CSC for the same surgery, isn't it? So suppose the spinal fails, what else could you have done? Give me only the steps.
Ma'am, if my spinal fails, I will go for general anesthesia with graded epidural. General anesthesia with graded epidural.
Okay. Well done. Well done. Then, okay, you have already answered this question. Had you given a prophylactic dose of low molecular weight heparin in this patient, considering polytrauma, and or to bridge, then how would you plan insertion and removal of the epidural catheter with low molecular weight heparin?
Ma'am, as per ASRA guidelines, I need to before insertion 24 hours after giving low molecular weight, I will insert epidural catheter, and after giving low molecular weight heparin, after 24 hours, I need to remove the epidural catheter.
Okay. And okay, now identify the rhythm.
Yeah, no need to tell rate, rhythm, only rhythm.
Yeah, only rhythm.
Ma'am, it is atrial fibrillation.
Okay, now the questions.
Irregular rhythm, ma'am.
Very good. Okay.
No P waves, so I go with atrial fibrillation.
Okay. And what are the common causes of acute atrial fibrillation, intra-op?
Ma'am, acute atrial intra-op causes are sympathetic stress, sympathetic accentuation, pain, hypoxia, hypercarbia, acidosis, hypotension, inadequate depth of anesthesia. Then, ma'am, if there is perioperative MI.
Okay, and we go to the next. Intraoperative management of AF in a patient who was previously having normal sinus rhythm and now has stable hemodynamics. What will you do?
Ma'am, intraoperatively, as per the specific cause, I will treat the patient, like maintain adequate depth of anesthesia, not allow much fluctuation in blood pressure, avoid tachycardia, to avoid hypoxia, hypercarbia, acidosis. Then not to pain management I should take care of, which lead to increased sympathetic stress response. Then adequate maintaining the volume status of the patient.
Okay. And intraoperative management of acute atrial fibrillation in a previously normal patient with unstable hemodynamics.
My first step will be to give him synchronized cardioversion of 100 joule initially, as is unstable hemodynamics. I can increase it to 200 joules, ma'am, as it is narrow irregular complex as per the ACLS guideline. If it is not responding to cardioversion, then I need to go to the pharmacological agents, which consist of amiodarone, which is class 3 antiarrhythmic agent. Give the regimen of amiodarone is 300 mg of amiodarone in 5% dextrose, need to be infused over 30 minutes, and 10 to 50 mg per hour in next 18 to 24 hours. And if I can also add to it, ma'am, lignocaine infusion for atrial fibrillation.
Okay. Okay. And identify this rhythm.
Ma'am, it is monomorphic ventricular tachycardia. Ma'am.
Okay. Then what are the causes of intra-op VT? In what kind of patients do you expect? Does this happen frequently? Or
it doesn't happen that frequently, ma'am. It is
in which kind of patient do you think this will happen, or where is it seen? Mostly we don't see VT in intra-op areas.
Yeah,
okay. Yeah.
Ma'am,
There are particular subsets. Okay.
Yeah, ma'am. In elderly ischemic heart disease patient, diabetic hypertensive patient, who are more prone to ventricular tachycardia. Then, ma'am, also
all diabetic hypertensive.
No, ma'am, elderly.
Okay, elderly. Only if
if there is imbalance
any
between
underlying cardiac disease, cardiomyopathies,
myopathy, yes, ma'am, prior heart disease, if he is prior any incidence of unstable angina or myocardial ischemia infarction, then ma'am, cardiomyopathy, long QT syndrome, if it's there, then and cardiac arrest, ma'am, the last one.
Okay, before that, electrolytes, hyperkalemia,
patient
with respiratory acidosis going into hyperkalemia. Commoner things, you tell the commoner things, okay? Patient extubated a bit prematurely, and has respiratory acidosis, goes into subsequent hyperkalemia, he can have VTs. Okay.
Yeah, ma'am.
Then, okay. Then a patient in the post-op recovery room starts showing this rhythm on the monitor with a BP 73 by 45 mmHg. How will you manage?
Ma'am, as it is unstable scenario, my first plan will be to give him unsynchronous defibrillation or unsynchronous cardioversion of 200 joule of biphasic shock, ma'am.
And then? That's all.
Ma'am, this means it is unstable, so my first plan will be that.
Yeah, you have done the defibrillation.
Then I can give him antiarrhythmic drugs, ma'am.
Will you follow it up with chest compressions? You'll check for pulse and follow it with chest compressions.
Yeah, ma'am. Yeah, CPR I will start. Yeah.
You should say this. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
I will shock. Then I'll check for and I will start chest compression.
Chest compression.
And then I will, as per the ACLS algorithm, side by side, I will look for the cause.
Cause 4H4 causes, ma'am. Hypoxia, hydrogen ion, hyperkalemia, hypokalemia, hypothermia.
Yes.
Then, yeah.
Okay, we'll rephrase this answer. We'll say, since it's an unstable scenario, I will call for help, and then I'll immediately shock the patient, and then always the call for help has to be the first line. Okay, safety first, call for help, and then start. Okay.
Yeah.
Then the next question. Okay, this is a spotter X-ray. What do you see?
And it is dual chamber pacemaker, ma'am.
Okay.
The one chamber, it lies in right atrial appendage. The one electrode lies in right atrial appendage. The other one lies in right ventricle. So I will, on X-ray, I will say it is dual chamber pacemaker, ma'am.
Which mode is safer during surgery?
The safer modes are depend on the causes of insertion of pacemaker, ma'am. It can be AO mode, VOO mode, or DO mode, which are asynchronous modes.
Okay. You'll say asynchronous modes are safer during surgery. Okay. What are the precautions taken during surgery in the presence of this device?
If we are using cautery, ma'am, I will start with that. If we are using cautery, I need to use bipolar cautery. Inform the surgeon to not use unipolar cautery. If unipolar cautery is there, then I will ask the surgeon to put the plate away from the patient and use the burst, very short burst. The frequency will be one burst in 10 seconds. Then to change the mode, ma'am, to asynchronous mode prior to start of the surgery. If to keep a defibrillator ready in case of emergency, and put the defibrillator on mode all the times.
Okay.
And not to defibrillate the patient near the pulse generator, as it can lead to dislodgement of the lead. Also, ma'am, to keep the electrocautery not 15 centimeter within the area, ma'am.
And then we'll organize our answer into due to cautery and while defibrillation. Okay.
Okay.
Next is, after spinal anesthesia, how do you manage hypotension in this patient?
Ma'am, as paced heart, they don't respond to hypotension as compared to normal heart. In normal patient, the hypotension is the response is they become tachycardia. So this
There is no
response is
reflex tachycardia following
no
hypotension in these
hypertension.
Okay.
This patient. So I need to increase my pacemaker pacing, ma'am, the rate of the pacing as compared to earlier, and give him vasopressors, bolus vasopressor or infusion. The vasopressor consists of ephedrine 10 mg IV and start him on infusion, ma'am.
Or
Not
any other vasopressor, you know?
phenylephrine, ma'am.
Okay, which is better?
Ephedrine is phenylephrine is yeah. Ephedrine is better. Ephedrine, yeah.
And fluids?
And I will avoid fluid because I don't know the cause as the fluid, and also it is spinal anesthesia. There is peripheral vasodilation is there. There will be as I give the fluid and after the spinal anesthesia wear off, it can lead to fluid overload and pulmonary edema. So I will use judicious fluid along with monitoring of the hemodynamics and urine output. 0.5.
Can you increase the rate of the pacemaker?
Yeah, ma'am.
Can you increase the rate of the pacemaker? Will you consider?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So you can use vasopressors. You can consider increasing the rate of the pacemaker, and but fluids will be judicious. Okay. We'll see for signs of fluid deficit. You can talk about fluid deficit, and you can talk about the pulse oximeter waves if you don't have an arterial line in situ, because it's just spinal. Sometimes they can undulations of the pulse oximeter can also tell you about thoracic pressure, which
and also I will see the ECG, ma'am. The spikes of the pacemaker will not be detectable on the ECG. Intermittent, if there are intermittent spikes before P wave.
Okay. Then, okay, thank you, Dr. Pankaj Chenke, and all the best. Only one feedback I have, you have to organize your answer. You are very knowledgeable, you have prepared very well, but you have to organize your answer, okay? Always try to use according to history, examination, and then investigation. Always say by patient factors, comorbidities, and surgical factors. This is one thing. And you have to read a bit on exit procedures. Okay. I was looking for a little bit of detail. Like usually we compare exit procedure with LSCS and and we contrast. You get it? Yeah, that. About vecuronium, about a lot of drugs have implications. You have to read up a bit on that, okay? The rest of your Viva was fantastic, and congratulations, you did very well, and all the best for your exams.
Thank you, ma'am.
Pankaj, one more thing that in DNB, you have to remember that the questions are timed, 5 minutes, and I think you have to write it down, your answer. So, and you have to take papers to each section and note the answer. So once you come to that question, particular, you cannot go back. Okay, so you have to remember these things and try to have a stop clock or something like that so that you can time yourselves. And usually they give 8 marks. Suppose if they have 8 marks allotted per station, they divide, we have given 5 questions per station. Sometimes in DNB, they can have 2, or they can divide it as 4 plus 4. Or they may have 4 questions with 2 marks each. Okay. Try to answer as much as possible so that you gain more marks rather than concentrating on one question. So read the question properly once or twice and answer only particularly. Suppose if they ask you like enumerate the drugs, enumerate only the drugs. Don't write anything more than that.
Okay, sir.
You'll be awarded more marks if you detail other things like mechanism of action, something like that. Okay. And whenever you are asked to respond to a clinical scenario, try to concisely answer only to that clinical scenario. Okay. So save time means suppose you have 5 questions, you have to write each question with 1 minute. Okay. What we are given is a very tougher situation. You may not have such situation. But in exam, try to be very concise, and once your time is over, suppose you have 5 questions and you are able to answer only 3, you lose 2 questions.
2 questions, yes, sir.
Okay, so remember the time is a factor and you have to go very quick. Okay? But in our thing, you didn't have a rest station after 7th question.
Yes, yes.
You will have after 7th question.
No, sir, it's good that it stretches a bit. So yes.
So it's very trickier. Yeah, it's very new to us. So we need to train ourselves well. And even in our 3 years course, we won't have not even a single session on OSCE given to you. Were you given OSCE training during your post graduation?
No, sir, first time.
That's the only thing, because case presentations, you would have got a lot of case presentation experience. Table vivas, you would have got bedside questioning. But OSCE is a very tricky, so practice very well and at least practice 5 to 10 questions per day before you go for exam, so that you know how to answer them. Okay?
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
Okay, all the best. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you
so much.
Bye.
It's a very wonderful session conducted.
Yes, and all the best. Do very well.
Yeah, ma'am. Yeah, thank you.
Bye, Pankaj. Bye, Sai.
Bye. Thank you, Suren.